Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So in the last 3 days we've spent a bit of time thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, what it stands for, what some of its problems are. And yesterday in particular we looked at what I described as the false gospel of the Black Lives Matter movement and how it doesn't provide any hope at all for us to be reconciled with God. And equally, it doesn't provide a way even to achieve its stated aims of bringing reconciliation between peoples. Now, what that does, inevitably, as I hinted at the end of that previous video, is to challenge us as a church, because it's no use us just pointing the finger at the Black Lives Matter movement and saying, you're preaching a false gospel. We need to be ready to hear a painful challenge to ourselves concerning how we as a church are to live out the true gospel. Whenever we see somebody doing something else wrong, it's always very tempting, isn't it, to just point the finger, but we mustn't do that. We must hear the implicit challenge to ourselves. How can we as a church live out the true gospel that shows that we are genuinely reconciled with the living God and that we are genuinely a true community living in unity with each other? Well, I want to approach this from a slightly oblique angle, which will also allow me to answer a question or two that some people have asked over the last week or two about how things are going here in London at Emmanuel Church, where I've been minister for 10 or more years and I'm now serving and as a member of the congregation. I wanted to let you know how things are going, and this will illustrate how we are imperfectly doing things, and I emphasise the imperfectly, as you'll see in a moment. So basically, in the last few months, we have been restricted to online-only services for all the obvious reasons, and our usual venue has been closed, and even when the restrictions on gatherings were lifted a couple of weeks ago for the first time in several months, our usual venue, we don't own a building, our usual venue remained closed. We explored 20 or so other venues, and at that time we got no success in finding anywhere that would let us rent any space. So we all dressed up and nowhere to go, so we decided to have church in the open air. So the last 2 weeks, that's what we've done. We've gone to the local park, and it was just wonderful. I can't tell you how wonderful it was to be back together again. I'd realised I'd not seen these people I'd not seen my pastor for 4 months or 5 months or something. Pastor Steve Hayhow has taken over from me as minister here in London. And yet, for all that, it will be easy to over-romanticise the experience. I'm sure you can imagine us sort of sitting on the beautiful green grass in the rolling hills of the English countryside. And I was trying to give you I'd like to give you a picture of the kind of realities of life on the ground, so to speak, here. And on the ground is part of the problem, because that, of course, is where we were sitting. But that's just the beginning of it. So we had church in the park, and there was this near endless series of distractions. So you've got all the usual things, the wind noise and the people jogging past, or everyone's trying to control their distracted children, and all these crowds of gawking teenagers who suddenly, for some reason, were up on a Sunday morning. I don't know why that was. It was quite a windy day, so all the bulletins were blowing around in the breeze, and at one point I was doing the reading just before Pastor Hayhow preached, and this dog bounded up to the communion table to just take a sniff of the communion wine. It was just chaos. There were no changing facilities for babies. There were no toilet facilities for anybody. They've all been closed because of the risk of infection. And so there were fair few fidgeting under 10-year-olds by the time we got to the end of our hour and 30-minute service. We attempted to provide for people who were worshipping from home who weren't able to make it for whatever reason. And so we set up I set up a Facebook live stream, but unfortunately that was pretty catastrophic. It just didn't work. So we ended up just with the backup plan, excuse me. And so I had this video camera mounted on a tripod, and yes, you've guessed it, the wind blew the tripod over at one point. It was a cheap one, little plastic thing I got off eBay for £10, and I probably should have spent a bit more money or weighted it down. But anyway, that was my fault. So at some point, everyone got slightly seasick watching us on YouTube or however they watched us. Those parts of the service which should have been most dignified were probably the most farcical. I don't know how many insects and bits of grit and dust blew into the communion wine. The tablecloth on the Lord's table nearly blew away a couple of times, and I don't think anybody really enjoyed receiving the Lord's Supper from me wearing gloved hands, but there it is. On the subject of the Lord's Supper, actually, I only realised halfway through the service that we'd made a big mistake, because the fears of infection had led us to the conclusion that what we should do was to give out individual bread rolls, and like one per household, so that we were observing some kind of cleanliness hygiene thing. And so instead of having our one usual lovely communion loaf, which we break in true 1 Corinthians style, we had individual bread rolls. And so what we'd actually done, without realising it, except I realised halfway through, that we'd suddenly defaulted de facto to the practice of household communion, or head of household communion, where you give the bread to the father of the household or the head of the household, and then he distributes it to his family, which is a practice that we had rejected explicitly 10 years ago in an elders meeting for very good theological reasons. I think it's actually a bad idea to do things like that. And there we are, kind of without even realising what we were doing, we'd introduced this liturgical novelty into our worship because we were concerned for hygiene and we hadn't even thought through those issues. So it was chaos from beginning to end. And yet it was the most wonderful experience, because there we were, for all the faults, all the problems, all the indignities, all the things. We had no musical instruments, we had no way of, well, we did have one musical instrument. Ben played his trombone, poor lad, blowing his lips off his face, trying to make enough noise in the open air that we could all sing together. And yeah, it was just a mess from beginning to end, but it was a wonderful mess, because there we were together, worshipping the living God, for the first time in months. It's actually the first time my family and I had had the Lord's Supper since we were last with you in March. And I won't hear a word said against it. I won't hear a word of criticism of it. Because although it was undignified and chaotic and messy and distracted and interrupted, it was our worship which was undignified and chaotic and messy and interrupted and distracted. It was our congregation here worshipping the living God together. Worshipping the living God, that is, proclaiming the true gospel. Together, from, I think, something like 15 or 16 different nationalities at the moment. We've been as many as 25, and over the years I think we've probably had about 35 or 40 different nationalities here at Emmanuel in London. Living out the gospel by being together and worshipping God together. That is obviously the first and most important responsibility and privilege of any Christian congregation. If we're not doing that, then we are not standing against Black Lives Matter or any of the other false gospels in the world around us. If we are not together worshipping God, then we have no hope of taking on the ungodliness of the world around us. We have no hope, really, of embracing and enjoying the life that we ourselves have in communion with God through the Lord Jesus Christ either. Away with all this nonsense about engaging with the world in any other way if we're not engaging with the living God together in worship. I know of no other way to begin and continue and finish the fight against secularism and ungodliness and every other critical, theoretic false gospel in the world around us than by gathering together on the Lord's Day before the throne of the living God to worship him. And so that's what we did at Emmanuel for the last couple of weeks. The Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon.